You're on.
Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind.
And all your strength.
There we go. Hey, welcome to Trinity Talk Live, water cooler conversation from a Christian perspective. We promise we won't sing anymore. I'm Ken Coughlin.
And I'm Ben Lander.
And my wife has the volume on her phone. And now she doesn't. I don't know if you heard that through our mics or not. Probably not, unless she had her mic on. Anyway, so hey, welcome to Trinity Talk Live. Thank you very much for joining us. The byline says it all. We are water cooler conversation from a Christian perspective, which means our goal on this program is to talk about whatever topics people are out there talking about around the water cooler. Sometimes these are topics that are of specific concerns to Christians in the Christian community. Sometimes they're just topics of general interest. But what we always try to do is always try to put Christ first in our conversation about them. You may agree with us, you may disagree with us, but hopefully you'll walk out of this thinking that, hey, those guys at least did their best in their fallen humanity to put Jesus first when talking about it. Sometimes we put our fallen humanity more on display than other times. We'll see how much we do tonight.
Yeah.
So, hey, you are invited to be part of the program. This is a conversation program, but not just a conversation between Ben and I. It's also a conversation between you all and both of us. And the way you can join in that conversation, as I put on my best radio announcer voice, just realized how corny I'm sounding right now. My wife is nodding in agreement. Don't be too enthusiastic about that, honey. We are live right now on both the Trinity Joppa YouTube channel and the Trinity Joppa Facebook page. You can comment in either one of those forums, in the comment section on Facebook or in the live chat on YouTube. And if you type up your comment in either of those forms, it will appear over there in that box to Ben's left. And also, once we have a break in the conversation, a natural break in the conversation, I will see your comment here on my computer. And if I don't, my wife will hold up a sign to make sure I pay attention and notice it. And we will talk to you. We'll address whatever your comments are, respond to you, answer questions, go back and forth. That's what, obviously the programs that have the most people interacting are the ones that are the most fun. Is that your phone?
I think it is.
Okay, but it's not like an alarm going off. We don't have to evacuate the building or anything, right?
Oh, no, there's just somebody at my door.
Okay. Dude, who? Put him on air. Is it somebody you want to put on air?
Oh, no, it's probably one of the neighborhood kids.
Okay, then no. I figured it was a burglar, we could put him up there.
Well, hey,
You're busted. So, anyway, no, seriously, thanks for joining us, everybody, and please join the conversation. Now, something else that we like to do on this program is we know that not everybody can watch us live. We love it when people are watching us live because that really gives us the live interaction back and forth. But we know not everybody can do it. So we do invite folks that if you don't watch the program live, you watch it sometime during the following week, to go ahead and still put your comments, if you have a comment, into the comment section on YouTube, and then we will go back at the top of the next week's show, time permitting and depending on the number of comments, and respond to those comments. And lo and behold, this week we have some comments on last week's program, so we are going to go ahead and talk to those folks. And then maybe if you're watching us live, great, interact. If not, if you're watching it later, leave another comment. That's fine. The greatest thing is that the first two comments are from Brian Brownell, and I'm probably still mispronouncing that. If you were watching us last week, you'll remember we kind of gave a shout out to Brian because we saw that he was commenting on a number of the programs, and like he was binge watching Trinity Talk Live, I guess. And commenting on a number of them. And we kind of joking around said, because of where he was, say, hey Brian, whenever you get to this week's program, you can comment on it, and this is how we do it, and explain how we do it. You comment on that week, and we'll address it the next week, but we don't really go back to like really old shows. We don't have time for all that. And lo and behold, Brian's got two comments on here. So thank you, Brian.
Yeah.
His first one, I agree with wholeheartedly. He's taking I don't know if it's a shot. He's making a reference to a little joke I made last week. His comment is, I would not underestimate the power of the Gregorian chant. And that was in reference to one of my recurring lines when people are critical of contemporary worship. They always say, we want to do the traditional stuff. And I always say, you know what?
What's traditional?
What's traditional? Because even what you call traditional at some point was contemporary. How far you want to go back to the Gregorian valedictorian chant under that logic. I mean, heck, you go back even further than that, and let's just recite the Psalms, and clang cymbals.
That actually would be kind of cool.
That would be kind of cool. Actually, now that I say that, I'm thinking, hey, actually, that wouldn't be a bad idea.
More songs based on the Psalms.
And then Brian also says, what a relief it has been to start seeing faces again. I've seen people that, if you met someone during the pandemic, you didn't even know what the bottom half of their face looks like, and now you do. I mean, who knew that Ben could grow a beard? I mean, it's amazing.
Yeah, right? No, my 11-month-old, that's all he's known. And so, even in church, he'll, pull our masks off and everything. But yeah, other people, now he's just for the first time starting to see their faces.
Oh, he does have a smile. That's
Right.
So, no, it's been great, Brian, and we appreciate it. We all, just more than anything, I'm happy about it because what it symbolizes is that hopefully we're kind of working our way out of this pandemic, and that's a good thing. But we'll be talking about the pandemic a little bit more tonight.
This has been the longest 2 weeks of my life.
2 weeks to flatten the curve, right?
Yeah.
All right. Then we have another comment here, and I apologize if I mispronounce it. It looks like it's from Alan Flinchbaugh. And Alan is responding to the story we talked about last week where we were talking about John Cena issuing an apology to the Chinese people for referring to Taiwan as a country. And Alan, talks about, he says weak men kneel to the CCP, which is the Chinese Communist Party. Yes, I got him backwards there to start off with. And then he also says weak men will kneel to the Prince of Lies. Weak men call Christians religious extremists, and that was another story that we talked about last week. So he's kind of tying several of them together. And then he gives four kind of stages, like a progression that looks like he's advocating for. He says, number 1, hard times create strong men. Number 2, strong men create good times. Number 3, good times create weak men. Number 4, weak men create hard times. And says in that cycle, he says, we're at number 4. It's a cycle for civilizations. It's happened many times before, nothing new under the sun. Don't invest yourself in things that are temporal or have shallow rewards. And then he kind of throws at the end, P.S. Taiwan is a country, China is simply an evil empire. And but I'll just comment on that last statement there. You know what? If you believe Taiwan's a country, I'll reiterate what I said last week. If you've come to the conclusion that Taiwan's a country, great. As long as you've come to that conclusion, through looking at, knowing the history and knowing the facts. It is a complicated history, but we talked about our views on that last week. But what do you think about his cycle that he's proposing there, Ben?
I don't know if it's I don't want to say it's an oversimplification of things, but we do see evidence of, in Christendom, we see the church growing the most in times of adversity, in times of really strong persecution. You see that in the early church, of course, under Nero and all of those emperors. And so I think there might be something to that adversity produces strength, strength of character, strength of...
Well, even today, you look at where the places. Remember the study we talked about a little while ago? That's the places where Christianity is growing the most in the world today. The places where it's most heavily persecuted.
Absolutely, and I think we talked about that too. The correlation a little bit of it's on the decline in America, and
right.
Even places. What was it? Was it Hungary or one of the?
It was Hungary. We talked about Hungary. Yeah.
Yeah, that you would think that it's the official Christianity is the official religion, but it's actually on the decline in Hungary too. So it's kind of
so. Yeah, thank you very much, everybody, for commenting on last week's program. If you're watching this week's program after the fact and you have any comments on any of the topics that we're talking about tonight, throw them there in the comment section on YouTube. I'm not including Facebook in it just because it's a little, Facebook just a little bit harder to track down the comment section. I just don't have time for that. YouTube is pretty easy to pull them up. So if you're watching after the fact, even if you're watching it on Facebook after the fact, go over to the YouTube channel, leave your comment there, and that's kind of where we draw them from to address them at the start of the next week's show. So that being said, we got 4 topics to get through tonight, and Ben is going to introduce our first one, which if anybody, unless you've been living under a rock lately, you've heard about this one. What is it, Ben?
Yeah, we actually, as we were talking about this, we kind of share the concern that sometimes maybe we get a little too political on this show. Not that that's our intention. Of course, we want to just take what everybody's talking about, and it's hard to escape politics in this day and age. So it's something that's kind of shown up more in the political sphere, or I guess it's just.
But I think it's important to try to model, how do we talk about these political issues from a Christian perspective?
Exactly.
Because, I mean, what are the two topics people say you shouldn't talk around the dinner table?
Religion and politics.
Yeah. But we should be able to. And I think part of the reason we become so divided is, and culture becomes divisive, is because we don't feel like we can have courteous, respectful conversations about those things.
Right, exactly. And so the more we can model and emulate that and practice it, it's good.
We actually do.
Yeah, we'll try. So actually, Ken made a reference earlier that we're going to be talking about the pandemic, and this is that portion of the show. So again, unless you've been living under a rock, there are a number of different places you can find this. It's been reported. There's one that we have here from the Wall Street Journal, another one from Reuters. I think Vox is on here. Several different, pretty much every major news reporting place has put this out there. So some emails have been released, emails from Dr. Anthony Fauci, I think to the tune of about 1,000 emails or so. Over 1,000 emails were released and published under the Freedom of Information Act. And
not leaked. A lot of people have been saying
they say leaked.
They're not leaked
Right.
emails.
Been released
legally, pursuant to the legal process, all that.
Yeah, under this Freedom of Information Act. And what some of these emails have been showing lends a little bit more credibility, I guess, into the reopening of the investigation of the theory that, way back a year ago was that the coronavirus, COVID, had been leaked from a lab in Wuhan, specifically the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And so there was an investigation that was done into that, and initial investigation said that they didn't see any hard evidence, any credible evidence for that being the case. However, now there's a resurgence of a call to reinvestigate that or dig deeper, because a lot of people are saying now that some of what has been said in these emails, while not overtly saying one thing or another, kind of pointing at how little we actually did know at the beginning of this pandemic. I think, if anything, that's kind of the takeaway from it, that even the top brass were still kind of piecing it together as we went along, and receiving information. So some evidence, especially with the gain of function research that Fauci and the WHO were engaged in, not themselves, but
funding. They were supporting the research being done in that lab.
Yeah, in the Wuhan Institute of Virology, specifically between Dr. Xi and the American doctor whose name escapes me right now. But anyway, so there were certain things in there lending credibility to this theory that now is gaining more traction again.
Yeah.
So I guess that's it in a nutshell.
In a nutshell, yeah. And I like how you put it. It's a theory that's gaining more traction. And I think, first of all, that's the responsible way to talk about it right now, because and I think the bigger issue is how it should have been talked about a year ago. We'll get into that in a minute. But I'm not going to call this person out by name, but like, I've got a Facebook friend, someone that we knew each other in high school, haven't talked to each other since then, but we're friends on Facebook, who's very, very right wing, who has said, now what are all the Democrats going to do now? It's definitively proven that the coronavirus came from a lab leak in China. It's like, it's not definitively proven, but there's some circumstantial evidence that's coming out that is it's inspiring people to say, hey, we need to look into this more. And that's absolutely the case. So, let's just be accurate about it. Now, as far as the emails, because that's kind of what we did the lead in here, what do these emails, what impression did they leave me with, at least what I've seen reported? And I've tried to read as many different outlets and coverage of it as possible. Let's just say they have reaffirmed my views on politicians and the media. So there's gonna be stuff on both sides here, but it's I'll give you some examples. Let's look through some of these emails and let's see some of the reaction on both sides about it. And I'll forewarn you, I'm gonna criticize both sides on some of these. Because you've got the folks on the right that are saying all these emails are completely condemning of Fauci, and you've got people on the left, including most of the media, saying, they really don't show anything. Truth's in the middle, in my opinion. Like there's an email. One of the emails that's been cited in a lot of stories is one from February 2020, and that's key as well, where apparently someone was asking Dr. Fauci for advice. She was about to go on a trip and was asking advice about whether she should wear a mask or not. And in that email, Dr. Fauci said, and this is a quote, "The typical mask you buy in the drugstore is not really effective in keeping out virus, which is small enough to pass through material. It might, however, provide some slight benefit to keep out gross droplets if someone coughs or sneezes on you." And so a lot of people, a lot of conservatives have latched onto that one and said, look, he admitted back then that masks weren't effective at all. On that one, I'm saying, no, that's not what first of all, he said this in February 2020, before we were even in a pandemic. And, yes, knowledge does grow as we get more samples from the virus and you learn more about it. So, I mean, that's the first thing about that one. And second of all, if you really look down at what he said there's pretty darn close to what he was saying later on. Nobody ever claimed, all he did was kind of reverse the last part, but nobody ever claimed that wearing a store-bought mask was going to protect you from, you getting the virus. The point was that if you started coughing or sputum coming out of your mouth, that it would catch it. And so not as many droplets would escape from you to another person. And what he said in the in his email back then was, well, maybe it might catch a droplet if somebody else coughs on you to keep it from going into your mouth. Okay, but it was minimal in that regard. So there were some slight differences in what he said to what he said later on, but that one didn't bother me a whole lot.
Even back then, when at the onset of the pandemic, that's why all the N95 masks were being bought up, because those were the ones that were effective.
Right.
Because he says he specifies the ones that you typically buy in the store.
And I get that was probably part of the concern is that, and now we get into politics. Well, maybe we'll touch on this more later. I didn't want to hammer this home too much, but there's a question arising. Well, did they not mention, go too much into that and how the N95 masks are more effective because they didn't want to rush on those and then not being able to have them available for the healthcare industry?
Sure.
But now here's another one, an email that came out. There was an email from, what was his first name? Dr. Christian Anderson. Well, his first name's Christian, and I forgot that. That's embarrassing. But he spells it with a K. Now, Dr. Anderson, and this email I'm going to give you, my conclusion is going to be a mixed bag on this one. This is the midpoint one. He wrote on February 1st, 2020, and Dr. Anderson was researching the origins of the virus. Okay, now Dr. Anderson sent an email to Dr. Fauci that said that the virus had some very small, unusual features. Actually, has less than 0.1% of the genome of the virus was unusual. But that he said, so one has to look really closely at all the sequences to see that some of the features potentially look engineered. Now, this was his opinion back on February 1st of 2020, that there could have been, not saying there were, but there could be some features of the coronavirus at that point in time that could have been engineered. Now, in all fairness, I don't think too many people think that anymore, but that was, we can get into what a leak really means, a lab leak versus, it doesn't necessarily mean it has to be engineered. But back then he was saying it could be engineered. 4 days later, Dr. Anderson is giving some feedback in advance of a National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine letter. And when he's giving that feedback, it's about the coronavirus, when he's giving that feedback, he actually refers to any theory that the virus could have been engineered as a, quote, crackpot theory. 4 days later. So 4 days after he just said this was a potentially plausible theory.
It's a pretty hard swing.
And he tried to explain this later on by saying, we got more information and we changed our opinions in 4 days. I mean, don't get me wrong. If you did get information during those 4 days, I can see you coming out and saying, yeah, I saw something yesterday that changed my opinion, so now I don't really think that's plausible. But to go so far as to call it a crackpot theory that you yourself, well, I didn't necessarily hold, you at least thought it was something worth looking into just 4 days earlier, that's a big swing. Now, and that's what bothered me about that email. Now, I will say what didn't bother me about that email, some people have looked at that email and then criticized Dr. Fauci for coming out later on and saying that he didn't believe that there was any chance it was engineered. He never said he didn't think there was any chance, but he says, I really don't think it's engineered. I think it's occurring in nature. And to that, I just say, so Dr. Anderson said he thought there was plausible. Fauci could have had a different opinion. I don't criticize Fauci at all for that email.
Neither one is saying a definitive at that point. Yeah.
But Anderson, I have some issues with Dr. Anderson. What are your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, well, yeah, like I said, that's a really big swing. And also, and that is kind of, I guess, maybe tipping my hand on how I feel about this is the political, what's the word I'm looking for? Politicizing of the entire thing. That seems to me a very political response to go so far as to say that it's a crackpot theory. Because, I mean, even look at, the fact that we're even discussing this right now, and that was so heavily moderated just a few months ago under misinformation and all the news media outlets coming out about this crackpot theory, saying it's conspiratorial and everything like that. And now all of a sudden there's credibility and we can talk about it.
Yeah.
So that just concerns me in a broad sense of how much control the media has over the science here. Like what really I think as Christians we should be about is the truth. Jesus himself says, anyone who's on the side of truth will listen to me. So we should be on the side of truth and trying to get to the bottom of things, however inconvenient of a truth that may be. Not trying to make a political statement about Al Gore there. But yeah, so that concerns me as far as like what we've seen over the course of this pandemic with the politicization and the hyperbole that's being thrown about and bandied about. And look at those. There were about 27 scientists who signed that letter who saying that this is in no way,
27 scientists who signed a letter that turned out to be coordinated by someone who was affiliated with that lab.
The Wuhan Institute of Virology.
So it wasn't just like, let's 27 scientists get together and say we say. It was somebody who had a vested interest in that being the viewpoint, going up to these scientists and say, hey, will you sign this? Will you sign this? Will you sign this? And and again, I don't know. I'm not going to speak to people's motivations. I don't know exactly what people's motivations were. I'm just going to speak to the optics of it. Look, let's be upfront and honest with it. And, we've been critical of former President Trump on a number of occasions, and I'll be critical of him in this regard, that while he did advance this theory, did he advance it in a way that was antagonistic? Yes. Yeah. He absolutely did. He arguably racist in some of the ways that he put it.
And again, that's that hyperbole, that over statement.
And so what happens when he did that, did that create a political atmosphere where there's so much animosity between the two sides right now that created, shall we say, a disincentive for people to, or maybe more of a positive incentive for folks like Dr. Anderson to say, oh, it's a crackpot theory because they just don't want to give any credibility to President Trump.
Yeah, I'd be willing to bet that that's at least partly.
That's the optics. Am I saying that's definitely what was going on in their head? I don't know what was going on in their head, but you can't look back on this in hindsight and not realize that, but that's kind of the way it looks. It looks like you weren't being forthright with what your medical opinions were for political reasons. And former President Trump bears some responsibility in that because of his rhetoric, and the scientists who weren't forthright bear responsibility as well in that. Why can't we all just get past the hyperbole and just let's look for the truth, like you say? Yeah. One other factor I want to bring out that's not directly related to an email but a response to it. I talked about the fact that I did not personally blame Dr. Fauci at all for the response to Dr. Anderson's email because he could have just had a different opinion. But his response to it, apparently some conservative outlets have said, how could he possibly say that there's no chance, or in his opinion, it was purely natural when he's receiving emails from Dr. Anderson saying it might not be. And he gave an interview to CNN, and here was his response to CNN when he was asked about that. He says, I've always said and will say today to you that I still believe the most likely origin is from an animal species to a human. So far, so good. That's your opinion, Dr. Fauci. I got no problem with that.
At least he's consistent.
Yeah. The idea, I think, is quite far-fetched that the Chinese deliberately engineered something so that they could kill themselves as well as other people. I think that's a bit far out. You know what, Dr. Fauci? I agree with you, and that's not what anyone is saying happened.
Right.
That's hyperbole that coming out of him. Why would the Chinese deliberately do something to kill themselves? Who's saying they were creating the coronavirus to, deliberately leak it onto their own employees and.
And that's speculative of their reasoning. A lab leak, and this kind of gets to what you were saying.
Right.
Let's look at what a lab leak actually means. It doesn't necessarily mean that they were intentionally engineering a bioweapon. It could have just been through this gain-of-function research. We can talk about the morality of that, the ethics of
There's
that.
definitely some bioweapon implications of gain-of-function research.
Yeah, but it could just have been accidentally. There could have been an accidental exposure.
Well, and I bet that's what anybody who's even advancing and saying we should investigate the lab leak
isn't saying that it was.
I'm not. I guess I can't say
intentionally
nobody's
engineered.
saying that, but by and large, people are thinking it was probably accidental.
Right.
You know, I mean, even one of the articles I was reading, talked about there's different levels of, and I can't remember what the categories are called, but different levels of biohazard precautions you can take when you're doing this type of research. And there's been some criticism that the level that was being implemented by the laboratory in question was not as high as some other levels set. But even that still gets at it being, if it was a leak at all, an accidental leak, you know? So...
Well, it kind of gets into that's all part of this theory, but like you said, the optics of it, the CCP's treatment of those scientists, because remember back at the beginning there were some whistleblower scientists who came out and they were silenced pretty rapidly. And one of the reports on here, I forget which article it was now, but some scientists of that initial report, the initial investigation, were talking about when they went over to Wuhan to investigate. It seemed, one of the scientists said, it seemed very political in the way that they were led through this investigation, to the point where they went through a museum and it showed the brave, scientists and China's brave response to this. And even when they went through the Wuhan Institute of Virology, there were certain areas that they weren't allowed to go into, and there's just kind of a little bit of suspicion raised there. But.
Yeah, you're dealing with the Chinese government that. It's a communist government. They do what they want to do, and they clearly, and again, I'm going to reiterate this. It's a theory. It's something worth investigating. Anybody that's going to leave this thinking that, Ken and Ben are saying it was definitely a leak from, well, I'm not going to speak for Ben, but I'm not saying it was definitely a leak. I'm not. I'm saying we don't know. We don't know. It could have occurred in nature. It could have been a accidental leak. I really don't believe it was, there's nothing to indicate it was an intentional leak.
No.
But we don't know and should be investigated. But, and I've now forgotten what my point was, but it was going to be brilliant. I promise you that.
I believe you.
Yeah. So, we're dealing with the Chinese government, communist government, and they don't want that. They don't want it to get out that they might be responsible for causing this, because talk about the international uproar that would cause.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't surprise me. There were 3 people that I think it was the Wall Street Journal. I'm maybe giving the wrong paper credit for first reporting it about the 3 people that in late 2019 who worked in that lab who were exhibiting symptoms that were consistent.
Hospitalized
For those with symptoms consistent with coronavirus or COVID-19. Does that in and of itself mean they have COVID-19? No, it doesn't. But it's one of those circumstantial pieces.
Oh, and you have to be really careful. I mean, the number of times we were like, is this coronavirus? Because everybody's symptoms were different. You could have you could be asymptomatic and have it. I mean, it could look like the flu.
Right.
I mean,
right.
Well, and
how are you going to know?
And the gain of function thing, because this is funny, it's one of those terms that gets bandied around. I kind of want to mention it in passing here, at least before we go on to the next topic, because a lot of the articles I was reading didn't actually tell you what gain of function research was. It's like, well, what's that mean? And it's, if I were to put it in layman's terms, it's to take an existing virus and make it worse. It's to take
to gain functionality.
Exactly. Primarily in contagiousness.
Pathology?
Yeah,
I guess.
How contagious it is.
Yeah.
To make it more contagious. Now, you might be asking, well, why on earth would you want to do that? Legitimately, well, obviously one reason you might want to do that is to create a biological weapon out of something that's already existing. But in theory, I don't work in this field, but my understanding is it can help you create, remedies to it. So if there is some kind of outbreak, by doing this gain of function research ahead of time, you can kind of get ahead of the game and hopefully already having a vaccine or something like that, right? So that's the point of that type of research, and that's what you get. It does raise some serious ethical questions in there, but I do not think I know enough about it to be equipped to answer that ethical question, but I can certainly see where the issues arise. So, did we walk the fine line on that one? I don't know.
Tried to.
Tried to. All right. So let's move on to our second story of the night. Now, this is one that was the next day, or was it even the same night? I don't remember.
Yeah.
It was right.
It was the same day because it was reported the next
It
morning.
was reported the next morning. Well, the right after last week's show. That's right. I saw it the following morning at the Today Show.
Yeah, 'cause you said
my wife and I help take care of. We take care of her father, and he's got a number of medical needs that he needs taken care of. And I was getting his various different shoe paraphernalia and his diabetic stockings and everything on him. And he always watches the Today Show in the morning. I don't know why he watches the Today Show. Let's just say he's politically probably even more right than I am, but he likes to watch the Today Show. And he was watching it, and the story came on. And as soon as I saw it, in light of one of the topics we had talked about last week, I emailed Ben right away and says, "Oh, we're talking about this one." All right. So before we get into that new story, though, I do have an update.
What the old one was.
Yeah, we have an update for the last story. So the story that I'm referring to was one concerning, what was her name? Savannah Leffler, we talked about last week. Now, I do think we might have misstated something slightly. It doesn't end up making a difference, but it did make a difference in the response or with the update. Savannah Leffler was the valedictorian in a school in Michigan, high school, and she had, according to these procedures there, she had to submit a speech that she was going to give for school approval, before she actually gave it. Well, we had said the speech was going to be her valedictorian speech at the graduation ceremony. It wasn't to be delivered at the graduation ceremony, apparently. It was to be delivered at an honors banquet before the graduation ceremony. It was part of the whole graduation festivities, I guess. Regardless, she submitted in her speech, one of the things she tried to say was talked about people finding meaning in life and says, well, Plato says you find it here. Darwin says you find it here. I say you find it in Jesus Christ. All right. That's the nutshell. Her principal at the time said, you can't deliver this. You could talk about that Darwin and that Plato stuff, but it's too Christianized. You can't talk about the Jesus thing. You got to take that out. Law firm got involved and told them that you let her give her speech or we're going to sue. Well, what has happened since then, 'cause I think we even mentioned last week that they were supposed to be meeting with the administration of the school that day that we were on the air last week. Well, the principal has issued a statement stating that they were going to make a one-time non-negotiable relinquishment of control over Miss Leffler's comments. And this is the quote. So the video of Miss Leffler's speech will contain, because that's it, it was to be delivered on video. It wasn't even a live thing. The video of Miss Leffler's speech will contain a clear disclaimer that the views espoused are Miss Leffler's alone and receive no endorsement or sponsorship from the school district. The school district's flexibility in this regard is consistent with its educational mission of supporting its students, even when the coursework is completed. So, and then they went on to try to say that...
Where are they located?
Somewhere in Michigan, I'm not sure exactly. They were trying to make a distinction, says, well, the mischaracterization because the Department of Education guidance was about graduation speeches. This was an honors banquet speech because the First Amendment makes that distinction. It was kind of ridiculous.
Not a safe space.
We're not going to keep talking about that story. This is just a lead-in. It's an update. She is going to be allowed to give her speech. They're putting a disclaimer on it saying exactly what the law already says, that it's not their speech. We know that. That's why we're going to lose. Now, the story I saw on the Today Show, the very next morning was a story of a young lady graduating from high school in Texas by the name of Paxton Smith. Now, Miss Smith's speech was at her graduation ceremony, and she had submitted a speech to her administrators, like you have to submit it so they can see what you're going to say, and they print it out, they put it on the podium for you, it's all sitting there. And she had prepared a speech that was all about how TV and media have shaped her worldview. We'll come back to that, put a pin in that. Yeah, you're right. It has. Anyway, that was the speech she was going to deliver. She gets up there, and that's not the speech she delivers. Now, I did see, and keep in mind, this was a young lady who was, the reason I saw it, she was actually being interviewed on the Today Show. All right.
I mean, she totally went off script.
She
a whole nother,
very deliberately went off script, and she even said that the only people she told she was going to do this were her parents. Well, that means you planned ahead of time that you were going to do this and told your parents, hey, I'm going to do this, So it was
Now,
it was
I have
deliberate.
even more of a problem with this.
It
I
was
thought it was just a partial go off
Oh no,
There's a whole other
telling the
speech.
story so we can. No, it was a whole other speech. It was I was going to say this, pull out another speech in dramatic fashion. Now I'm going to say this. And here's some quotes from what she said. She said, starting in September, there will be a ban on abortion after 6 weeks of pregnancy, regardless of whether the pregnancy was the result of rape or incest. And she's referring to a law that was passed and signed by Governor Greg Abbott in the heartbeat bill in Texas that says after 6 weeks, when a heartbeat can be detected, you can't have abortion anymore after that point in time in Texas.
Also, there's the provision in there that you can sue
Medical providers that violate that.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how that would shape up, but I would be interested in knowing more about that law, about how you would have standing to sue. Anyway, but you're right. There is that provision to hold them civilly, not criminally, but hold the actual medical providers, again, not the women, the medical providers civilly liable potentially.
not the birth givers.
Next story.
The story.
Getting ahead of things.
Sorry.
So she went on to say, Ms. Smith went on to say, I have dreams, hopes, and ambitions. Every girl here does. We have spent our whole lives working toward our futures, and without our consent or input, our control over our futures has been stripped away from us. I am terrified that if my contraceptives fail me, that if I'm raped, then my hopes and efforts and dreams for myself will no longer be relevant. I hope you can feel how gut-wrenching it is, how dehumanizing it is to have the autonomy over your own body taken from you. Put a pin in that one, too. This is called the irony episode, or portion of our show. A lot of pins. There's a lot of things that we're going to be taking a lot of pins out as we go through this one. As a result of this, needless to say, she received a lot of praise. Former presidential candidate Hillary Clinton tweeted about how brave she was for this. Comedian Sarah Silverman did something. Former Democratic Texas Congressman Beto O'Rourke thanked her for having the courage of your convictions and inspiring Texas with your refusal to accept injustice as the price of participation in civic life. So, and then of course, like I said, she's been doing the interview circuit, and I saw her on the Today Show, and all this is happening as a result. So, yeah, we're going to start with you, Ben, because I got a lot of pins to pull out. Go for it.
I'm doing the eyebrow rub.
Oh my God, where do I start?
So many pins that we could pull out of that. I mean, really, in contrast to the...
Pick a pin and let's sit there for a little bit.
Just let it seep out.
Which pin are you hitting first? Go ahead. I know which pin I want to hit first.
Yeah, right. Well, in contrast to the story that we covered last week, it's really, you can put them up next to each other, and it's a tale of two valedictorians. And it's such a stark contrast because if the shoe were on the other foot...
Well, we see what happens.
That it's praised and lauded, that somebody's standing by their convictions, even though those convictions directly fly in the face of the strongly held convictions of plenty of others. And again, the irony is just so rife in this whole speech, to the degree that one of our favorite satire pieces, the Babylon Bee, picked up on that, and they were saying, out of her ages of wisdom, she
Her 18 years of
wisdom. Yeah. Anyway, I guess the first pin I want to pull out is the irony of the. Can you read again the quote that she said about how dehumanizing it is?
Oh yeah, that's a good one. That was going to be my third pin. I've actually got 4 total pins on my page here. I hope you can feel how gut-wrenching it is, how dehumanizing it is to have the autonomy over your own body taken from you.
Yeah,
I agree. By the way, I agree with that comment completely.
Yeah, for the unborn.
Take that next step.
Yes.
If that's a human life, if that's a human baby in the womb.
And you say it's not a human, that by definition is dehumanizing.
I want to know how many pregnant teenagers she talked to.
Well, and it tells you.
And how many of them got pregnant because they were raped?
Yeah.
How many of them got pregnant because their contraception failed? And how many of them just got swept up in the moment and had sex and didn't have contraception, weren't using it, and then got themselves into trouble? Because it only takes one time. Mm-hmm. I used to be a high school teacher. I had a student who got pregnant, and she said to me, Mrs. Coughlin, this was the first time. And I said, it only takes one, sweetheart.
That's right. Well, and the fact that her concern is more about my goals, my plans, my future is going to be
That's another
rendered.
pin. You're pulling out all my pins.
Sorry. I'll do these two. I'll give you the other two. So pin number 1, which was your pin number 3, that it by definition is dehumanizing when we call an unborn person with a heartbeat not a human, just a clump of fetal cells. Pin number 2 that I want to touch on is when she says, my goals, my future, all of these are effectively rendered moot by this unborn life. Well, what does that say about the value that you place on human life, that babies are just a burden? Now, understand, I don't want to be insensitive to those cases where someone's raped or incest or where it's going to be, even in that case, I don't know. I find it, first of all, those are very, very much the minority of cases.
But I had another student who she was date raped.
Well, when it's my turn, we'll get to some of the statistics on that. You might think that Christian apologist knows those, yeah.
and you do. But I do know a child who had that happen to her.
Yeah.
Guess what? She kept it.
Yeah, and it just says something about the lack of value that our society places on human life, that it is a burden, that that she can see no future if she were to get pregnant, even not by those extending circumstances, but just whether her birth control fails and she got caught up in the moment, something like that. The fact that she can see and envision no future that has any value to it with a child is frankly terrifying for the future of our society.
Oh, it's frankly insulting to single mothers out there.
Mm-hmm. Not even single mothers, working mothers.
Yeah, working mothers. Whether or not they got pregnant in that situation, or were married and got ran out on, or divorced, or even single fathers.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's.
Well,
you're so right. I mean, our children, there are people out there who work very hard to still achieve their dreams, even though they have a family.
And they make it work.
And they make it work.
Yeah, and I do want to try to.
And they are being applauded much more than somebody who just managed to get the highest GPA in a school.
I do want to try to. Look, I know obviously we all feel very strongly about this, and sometimes the danger is you get a little too sarcastic, and I don't want. Sure. I want to make sure we don't go there. I want to try to bring it down a bit to talk about this, well, empathetically. And I mean, I'll tell you in regard to that pin, I agree with you, Mary Kay. I think it's insulting. I also think I find that argument to be kind of sexist towards women. Now, people can disagree with me. I'm not a woman, obviously. I get it, but it's a message that our culture. Our political culture, those who want to, the abortion industry wants to keep going, and the message they send out there is, if you have a kid, you're worthless. You can't accomplish anything. Right. Men can pull themselves up by their bootstraps and they can overcome these obstacles. But women, you have a baby, sorry, that's the end for you. You can't overcome that. To me, I hear that argument, and that sounds very sexist to me. I mean, I'm sorry. I know a number of very strong women who have achieved quite a bit with kids.
Yeah. Or even the fact that children are something to overcome.
Right.
As opposed to a blessing, which is the biblical view.
But let's exactly. And that's another point. But I'll take a point that some people politically might not like, but let's talk about...
It's not so much the children that are a burden. It's the fact that you have them when you maybe don't have all the resources you need in order to raise them.
Sure.
But how many of us have said, you're never going to be ready to have kids?
Well, true. And
Ken and I thought we were ready.
And I think a lot of people actually try to suppress information about resources that are out there to help folks. And that's what's sad. But, I mean, just a case in point, Amy Coney Barrett. She is a Supreme Court justice with a bunch of kids. I can't even remember how much. So don't tell me that your life aspirations are over if you have children.
Right.
Okay? That's clearly not true. Now, does that mean that we as Christians should be doing as much as we possibly can to support people like Mary Kay saying there are certain people in
7
circumstances?
children. She has 7 children, and she's on the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
Yes. So I mean, it's not per se. Now some people would say that she was coming from a better economic background, all that, and I get that, and I do agree that we as Christians need to be supporting people. And here's one that's going to be a harder pill for people to swallow: supporting women who have had an abortion.
Yeah.
There's no scarlet letters going on here.
Yeah.
All right. And so that is part of our calling, and we absolutely certainly need to do that. In regard to the other pin, one of the other pins there, where her comment about, I hope you can feel how gut-wrenching it is, how dehumanizing it is to have the autonomy over your own body taken from you. I agree with you. I think there's 2 problems there. You point out the fact that it is dehumanizing to take something that is biologically human and call it a person. It also, she's talking about taking the autonomy, or call it not a person, rather. Yeah, I'm sorry. It's also, she also talks about how horrible it is to have the autonomy over your own body taken from you. That's exactly what abortion does.
Yep.
It does not give that unborn human being the right to choose what's going to be done to their body.
Right.
And so, I mean, I agree wholeheartedly with her statement. I just don't think she's thinking through the implications of that statement if what is inside the womb is, in fact, a human being with its own rights, which is why one of the things I consistently argue is that's the central question to the abortion debate. What is it?
Yep.
That's going to answer so many of these issues. Because if it is a human being with its own right to life, then everything that she just said in that statement would mean that we should not be having abortion.
It applies equally to the unborn child as it does to the mother.
Right.
Right.
All right. So is there another? I'm not seeing it on mine, but it looked like there's a
Facebook comment.
There's a Facebook comment.
We had a comment last week that got taken down. Tim Foster had tried to comment while we were live. It was a Bible verse that he had tried to put up, but we never saw it on the air. So,
Really?
Yeah.
I saw a message that got retracted. It looked like
That was somebody else. That wasn't Tim.
that was somebody else?
I did refresh my screen here, so I do have the comment on Facebook. It's from Jeanette Harrington. It says, yes, the lack of value that our society has on human life is so disturbing. And that Hillary Clinton statement, oh my gosh. Yeah, I mean, and there's another pin. There's actually probably more than 4 pins here, but here's another pin, and Jeanette, you kind of hit on it there, is not just Hillary Clinton, but the overall reaction of that took so much courage, praising her for this. And it just has me wondering, I mean, if you were to compare the 2 stories from last week and this week, last week we have a student who was doing what she's supposed to, honestly, right? Submitting the speech that she plans to give, a speech which we've talked about, she's legally allowed to give, and then being told she can't give it, which fortunately has been reversed now. That's good.
Right.
Whereas this one, we have a student who dishonestly and by her own admission deliberately. Now, I don't know when she came up with this idea. She may have decided, maybe at the time she submitted that speech, she fully intended to give that speech.
She said something about she was working on a project for music, so it wasn't like the night before. It was earlier in the week.
But she clearly, before she gave the speech, she made a deliberate choice and told her parents about it. I'm not going to give the speech I submitted.
I've got a question, just really quickly, just to get this out of the way, because I get the point that you're about ready to make. If she had submitted this speech, do you think the speech that she gave,
yes,
if she had submitted it, I think we're all in agreement that the school might have let her.
I would tell you that if the school told her no, I would have defended her right to give it. Legally speaking, I think she has the same legal rights.
If she had given it, turned it in ahead of time. Now, just so people understand, more often than not, they take these speeches to look them over because they also want to help the student sound.
Well, and there are some, like we talked about last week, there are some limitations they're allowed to enforce.
Yeah.
There are. Limited, but there are. And as much as my primary beef with her.
A lot of times it's for timing, language, and basically just to help them.
Yeah. My primary beef with her is that I agree. If number one, I think it was dishonest, and nobody's talking about that. What she did was dishonest. Had she submitted the speech ahead of time, then I would have supported her legal right to give it. I still would have disagreed with the content of it.
Right.
Which is some of the other pins here to be pulled out of some of the content. That's some of what we talked about already, some of the content of what she said. But as far as the question of whether or not she legally could give the speech, yes. And the school had come to her and said, we don't think you can give the speech. I may disagree about whether she should, whether it's the right forum and everything to do that. You know, I don't like, for example, I don't like award
But
shows.
she's gotten what she wanted. She's on a tour,
I know.
interview circuit.
And I don't, I don't like watching award shows anymore because I don't want to see the political speeches in those environments. Just like I don't want to go to a graduation ceremony and see a political speech. I don't. But that's just my personal preference. She has a different one. She has the right to do it. I would defend that. But the contrast between the two is startling, that everybody's praising her for being courageous and doing this wonderful thing, not acknowledging the fact that she lied.
Yeah.
She lied. Point blank. There's no other way to put it. I mean, she was, or at least you could say she was dishonest. She knew very well that she wasn't supposed to give this speech. She'd gone through the procedure, and she deceived her school in order to give a speech she wanted to do. And this is a person that we're praising for doing that.
She broke the rule.
If the shoe was on the other foot and she'd done the exact same thing but decided instead to praise this heartbeat law, do you think people would still be praising her for her courage?
No, she would have been decried. And that goes back to one of the other pins that you said, that she was raised by media and her views were influenced by media. And we see the effect that media has and the very clear bias, which I'm sorry, if you don't see the clear contrast here, you're just not looking. And the bias that the media has, and effectively the pull that it has, which has a snowball effect down the road to change people's minds and opinions and
Yeah, I
inform
really
them.
would like to hear her first speech. Talking about
honestly.
how media affected her worldview, because you're right, the contrast we've got here between, the media clearly trying to deliver and support one message and not another. Yes, that's going to affect people's worldviews.
Although, to answer the one question, in all fairness, whether or not if she had submitted this speech to the administrators, if they would have allowed her to give it, one of these articles, I forget which one, I couldn't find it in here, said that she was fully expecting to be cut off mid speech, and that have her diploma revoked or withheld or whatever. And I guess somewhere in here it said that it was considered, but it wasn't. That she wasn't cut off, and it was considered, I guess, having her diploma withheld, but it never was. She allowed to.
Yeah, and I'm not a fan of that. I'm not going to go into this story, but there's no story about a gentleman who wore the Mexican flag up to get his diploma, and it was a violation of dress code. And they denied giving him his diploma when he was out there at the ceremony, which I get. But apparently the principal, even as yesterday when I was last reading the stories, was still refusing to give him his diploma. I'm like, no, okay, he violated dress code. I get it. And so you say, look, you're not in dress code. You're not getting your diploma right now. Fine. But, you give it to him after the fact. He doesn't get in the ceremony. That's the punishment.
That has to do with crime. The crime
Fitting
the
the punishment, yeah.
The punishment fitting the crime.
Right. So Katie Lander here has a couple comments on YouTube that kind of lead to another pin that I was going to talk about. So here's what she has to say.
It's actually 3.
She now has 3. Yes, okay. From my understanding, the new law is saying after 6 weeks gestation. In the case of a rape or similar situations, it could be terminated before that 6-week point. I know oftentimes women don't disclose a rape, but there are ways to take care of that before that 6-week mark. Not that I'm an advocate for abortion by any means. There is always adoption as well, but in an extreme case, measures could be taken. Yeah, now here's the first of all, start with the statistics and why this is often an argument you hear all the time about rape and incest. And when I have someone, I'm in a conversation with someone, and they bring up the rape or incest argument, and one of the first questions I like to ask them is like, okay, let's clarify then. Do you agree with me then that we shouldn't be having abortion in all the other cases that don't involve rape or incest? And of course, they can't commit to that,
yeah,
because they don't. It's kind of disingenuous. When people bring up rape and incest, they don't really care about rape and incest. What they're doing is a logical fallacy called universalizing the exception. They're taking the very rare case and trying to draw on your emotional heartstrings in that rare case and then extrapolate that with no logical reason to, mind you, to the overwhelming number of other cases. 98.5% of abortions have nothing to do with rape or incest, okay? 98.5%. So that's what goes on is you take these few little cases that are the exception and try to get people to, rightfully so, have empathy and sympathy for that situation. I absolutely agree. And then say, well, because if we can convince you that the rule should be different for these minority of cases, well, then we're going to pretend that supports the rule for all cases, and it clearly does not. Now, I will say one of the issues with the rape and abortion exceptions, without getting, I mean, obviously the biggest issue is, does that support killing an innocent baby? It still comes back to that question. But the logistical issue is, how do you implement an exception like that? I mean, what would stop someone from claiming that they were raped from some stranger on the street and that's how it happened?
If you implement that exception, then does that 1.5% jump to 10 or 15%?
Yeah. And so that's what I've heard oftentimes about the criticisms of the rape and incest. Now, and I will tell you that that's a criticism I hear on both sides, because you'll have conservatives say, well, therefore we shouldn't have the rape and incest exceptions. And you'll have the more liberals say, and therefore we shouldn't have, any limitations on it. And so
it goes right back to the same problem.
Yeah, exactly. But it is one of those logical fallacies that's universalizing the exception on there. And I'm trying to look at my other pins here. I think we might have hit most of them. We hit the irony of the worldview comment. I think I've gotten all the pins pulled out.
Yeah, and just a sidebar, the universalizing the exception, we see that all the time in our society on multiple different issues. Just look at how far our society has gone to. I say it all the time on the show, that to the bowing down to the idol of tolerance, because we have to be tolerant to everybody's worldview, even however minority that is. We have to universalize that exception. Yeah. And, now it's governing what we can say. And if we're second guessing ourselves, if we're misgendering a fish. Literally, there was a post I saw, and it's one of those things like you either laugh or cry. But someone had posted on this picture of a koi fish or something and said, "Oh, look how cute he, she / they are." And someone responded, "Are you seriously worried about misgendering a fish?" But that's where we're at in society. So, sorry, that's my.
Oh, that's okay. You're kind of leading into the next story a little bit.
Yeah.
So, so Ben, what is our next story?
Well, speaking of misgendering, there is the new fiscal budget, to the tune of $6 trillion. The federal budget proposal that was just released. Let's see, when does it say when this was released? I'm not sure. This article is from the Washington Times this past Monday.
Right.
And by and large, it's a budget proposal, not too much excitement there. But one of the things that's been catching people's attention is the use of the trendy woke term birthing people in place of mothers or women. So in this proposal, progressive Democrats, they've kind of used this phrase to substitute mother or pregnant women to avoid excluding transgender men who are able to carry a baby. And so the term birthing people has been substituted in...
Because they're a woman with woman parts.
Right. So the term birthing... Well, here's the actual quote. The fiscal 2022 document says, to help end this high rate of maternal mortality and race-based disparities in outcomes among birthing people. And in addition to the investment in maternal health included in the American Families Plan, the budget includes more than $200 million. So... by and large, that's the case that's people are latching onto, saying birthing people in here. However, it's not entirely consistent, because elsewhere in this document, it says it supports providing paid leave to, quote, keep mothers in the workforce. So still using the phrase mothers there, not keep birthing people in the workforce. So still using some of that maternal language, mothers and women in some instances, but in other places using birthing people. So... by and large, that's what has come out of this. We're seeing a shift in our terminology, kind of a progressive shift in the terminology. And again, going back to that exception, invalidating the norm or, the universalization of the exception. And now we have to label all mothers and women as birthing people.
Yeah, I mean, I want to approach this story with grace. And in the sense that I am not going to question that there are legitimately many, many people in the world who feel quite sincerely that their gender identity does not match their physical identity.
Sure.
It's there. Now the question then becomes, well, how do we respond to that? How do we speak to that? And that's what I think we've seen a very big cultural shift in over the last couple of decades or so in what the response is to that. But I don't think we get anywhere by denying and not being willing to listen to the experiences of these people and to be empathetic toward them. There is a point, though, where you do have to get, truth matters, like you say, and obviously biblical truth matters. And from the biblical perspective, God created man and woman, male and female. And the reason folks who identify themselves as transgender male, the reason that they can give birth is because they are biologically female, and that's kind of what that's what God's talking about. He's made male, he's made female. If God made you male, you're not having kids. If God made you female, you are, or at least as general categories. Obviously, there are exceptions and all that. But, again, people try to quote individual exceptions to all of that, and that's, again, gets back to that universalizing the exception logical fallacy. So I do want to make sure that, when we as Christians talk about things like this, that we do it from the right attitude, from a loving perspective, but you stand for truth in things like that. And it's I when I hear things like this, I just wonder what needs to happen for people to realize the problems that this path that we're going down leads us to.
Sure.
I mean, if you get to the point where you're saying that people who are men can have babies, I mean, that's not far enough to make you realize that there's a problem here that we're not. Clearly, we've abandoned truth, like you say. There's biological truth, biological facts, and we can't get around them. And again, it's not that I'm discounting what the people are feeling. I do think, when I say, for example, that if somebody identifies as being a transgender male, when I say you are biologically female, I'm not by saying that denying the fact that you have these feelings that you feel like you should be a male. I can concede that. I'm not in your skin. I don't know what you're feeling. I can agree with that. But what I am saying is I don't think we as a society should be going to the point where we're affirming those feelings that you're having as truth.
Right.
The truth of the matter is still that you are biologically female. And we can be sympathetic, we can be empathetic, and we can work with you, and we can love you, and we can support you, we can do all of that. But we can't go that step of trying to say just because someone feels something, it's therefore true. And the logical inconsistency I've always had with this argument is if I've got someone who says that they're biologically female, but they believe they feel like they identify as male, well, then why is it that we automatically elevate the feeling to truth and not the biology to truth? I mean, there's at best you can look at that and say there's a conflict there, and maybe be agnostic about what the truth should be, which I don't think we should be. But that's, I think, the best argument you can make for that is that we don't know which way we should go because we got feelings saying one thing and biology saying something else. But to automatically, there's really no discussion I see as far as, well, why is this one the one we by default affirm and just kind of ignore and say, we assume the biology must be what's wrong, the feeling must be what's right. Why? What's the support for that?
I think you hit on something there, that we elevate the feeling or the experiential over the factual or the tangible, and that gets into it's kind of a Gnostic view, or that the only truth is that which I feel or inside, and even philosophically, there's this idea of that nothing is true except, and there's the phaneron that the only thing that is true is your experiences. Well, when your experiences and someone else's experiences clash, they can't both be true. That's logically not possible. Something else in this that I want to, I guess maybe we should think through logically, is it almost seems, taking all of that aside, just looking at from a logical standpoint here, if a biological male has done the procedure to have children, then they have all the parts necessary to have children. And would they not identify then as female? So why even do we need another term called birthing people? Because they would be considered a mother even if they were biologically male and transitioned into female.
Well, and I'll give you my answer and my understanding of that. And somebody that disagrees with me on this, please feel free. And I see BA's commenting, and we'll get to your comments once you're done. BA, I'll let you finish up before we address all that. But here's my understanding of that, because we've taken it to another step now. Understand when transgenderism was first kind of becoming a topic du jour, it was kind of directly related to the biological sexes. In other words, I would have someone who is biologically female identifying as a male, or somebody who's biologically male identifying as a female. And now we've gotten to the point where people are saying gender is a spectrum, right?
Okay.
And so there's no one, it's not just black or white, even on this gender identity spectrum. There's all sorts of places in between. And here's where, I might surprise people. I agree from the perspective that I talked about before, that I'm sure, there are people who have feelings along a spectrum, but it still comes back to me for that just you've got to justify why you're elevating the feeling over the objective biology. And between the two, one is subjective, one is objective. Why are we elevating the subjective above the objective? And is that really a standard you want to universalize?
Yeah. The danger in elevating the subjective and the feelings is that feelings are fleeting. We can't live by our feelings. Otherwise, we are, and look at where we are.
So I think,
Sorry.
Look where we are. Look where we are. All right. I think we've got it all here, BA. But if you're still typing, keep typing while I'm reading, and we'll just keep going here.
There's one more.
I've got a total of, now 5. Look at that. As soon as I say it, another one pops up. All right. So here's what we got. I got first-time talker, long-time listener. I just want to stress a single point about the argument, specific case versus general idea, as concerns law and individual logic. It's my rudimentary understanding of law that it has to make rules for edge cases to be protected, as compared to making rules to cover most people and letting exceptions occur. Like the case of the precocious toddler and fertile octogenarian in property law, they have to make rules in case this really odd and specific things happen, but in all likelihood, in all reality, it very likely won't. The trap comes from making an exception in English conversation as opposed to an American law conversation. I could put on my lawyer hat now for a minute, BA. Where the law, generally speaking, is primarily concerned with we'll call the minority view or the minority perspective, would be, you see this a lot in constitutional law. I mean, that's what our freedoms are supposed to protect. The whole idea why we have certain constitutional freedoms, for example, is so that the majority can't take control of the government and then try to deny the minority whatever those rights are that are protected constitutionally speaking. Freedom of speech is a classic example. Let's face it, human nature, I'm a pessimist about, just about everything. But if we didn't have the freedom of speech protected constitutionally, what would happen? We'd, have people in power, the majority viewpoint would take political power, and they'd pass laws saying, you are not allowed to say this. You're not allowed to believe that. Don't believe me?
We'll fire you.
Or we'll fire you.
Sorry,
or we'll,
what?
Let's be honest, or we'll imprison you. Well, I mean, there's plenty of governments throughout history where you can see some on the earth right now where that's
not even
exactly what's happening.
Yeah.
So there's plenty of evidence that is what will happen if we don't have, due to human nature, if we don't have these constitutional protections in place. And so those types of protections certainly are designed to protect, if you want to call it the exception or the minority viewpoint, things like that. There are certainly other cases where, where you do have laws that are passed, and they could be like statutory laws, things that are passed by legislatures, to determine what's going to happen in these exceptional cases. Normally, if you look at the history of the way a lot of these laws come about, however, the way they come about is you start out with a generally applicable law. And most laws, I would say, are generally applicable. You have a law against murder, it applies to everybody, But then what happens is, usually it's a result of litigation. Something comes up and people realize, wait a minute, that's not the way we wanted that generally applicable law to apply. We didn't think of this scenario actually happening. Oh, look, it did. And the Supreme Court's hands were tied because the law says what it says. And so they had to make this decision. We don't like that decision. So now let's carve out an exception to make sure this type of thing doesn't happen again. So there are laws that apply to the exception and apply to the rare case. But at least in my experience, that's generally how they come about. And it's not necessarily true that it is a general rule of legal theory or the philosophy of law, so to speak, that laws in general apply to the exceptions. No, I would argue that laws in general apply in general. They're designed to apply at as broad basis as possible, but then we have constitutional protections to protect the exceptions, and as necessary, we'll pass legislation to protect the exceptions. So I went on my legal rant. You got anything to add to that?
Nope. Well said. That's why you're the lawyer.
But you're right. But BA, what you're hitting on there, I think, really is a it's not even so much a legal question as that it's a philosophy of law question.
Yeah.
It's like, what's the role of law? What's the role of laws? And I would argue from a philosophy perspective, the role of law, of legislatures, things like that, really should be to impose the minimum amount of restriction necessary to have a free and functioning society. And where we get into trouble is when the legislatures, whatever your government tries to go beyond that. And that's where you see authoritarian governments and things like that, where they take it beyond that. It's just to provide the minimum amount of
ground
control.
your flight if you've spoken out against them.
Yeah, exactly. But going back to another previous story. So, all right. So far, so good. We've got, one left, right?
Last one.
Where is it? Okay, I've completely lost track. Why did I? Here it is. Okay. Because I'm supposed to introduce this one, right?
I believe so.
So this is we're talking about here is a study that just came out from, it was Lifeway Research, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was a new Lifeway Research study that, well, the article here wasn't completely clear. Looking at the context, it looks like it's speaking solely of the United States. And it does say that in 2019, and that's key.
Yeah.
Because this is before the pandemic hit.
Yep.
All right. In 2019, more Protestant churches closed than opened. So it doesn't include Catholic churches. They kind of do their own thing as far as, because they're overseen by a larger hierarchy, deciding who's going to close, who's going to open, things like that. Whereas most Protestant churches, they might be denominational, but let's just say that I think that a lot of them are more individually based as far as, they're kind of more on an island as far as, support and staying open and closing and things like that. So anyway, so the study said that 4,500 churches closed in 2019, while about 3,000 new congregations were started. So a net loss of about 1,500 congregations in 2019. It also pointed out that the rate at which churches were closing was getting faster, because in 2014, there were 3,700 churches that closed compared to 4,500 in 2019. So in 5 years, we see a jump of 800 more churches closing per year. Now, what I found interesting also about this article was never mentioned in the article. It was in the graphic. And it had a graphic. It's not just that, the number of churches closing is more rapidly increasing, but the number of churches opening is decreasing as well. Right. Because while even in 2014, you had 3,700 churches close, but you had 4,000 open.
Right.
So in 2014, the roles were reversed. We still had more churches opening than we had closing. And now 5 years later, you've got, because both, you've got this kind of inverse reaction here where, one is going down, the other one's going up. And so now the roles have flipped and we have more churches closing than we do opening. Now, this is in conjunction with another study that came out by the Center for Analytics Research and Data, which is affiliated with the United Church of Christ. And that other study said that in the decade ending in 2020, so the past 10 years, they said between 3,850 to 7,700 houses of worship closed per year in the United States, which works out to about 75 to 150 congregations per week were closing during that decade. And it's estimating that number is going to double or triple in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic. And this is all in conjunction with a Gallup poll that Pastor Jay actually talked about in a recent sermon, a Gallup poll that came out in March that found that we are now in a situation where fewer than half of Americans, 47% of Americans right now, say they belong to a church, synagogue, or mosque, which is down from more than 70% in 2000. So in the past 20 years, we've gone from 70% of Americans belong to some kind of religious institution down to 47%, a drop of 23% in a 20-year time period. So three kind of studies out there, but what's your takeaway from that?
Yeah, I think it's easy to get discouraged from that. In all fairness, I do want to point out one other part of this article that says they do try to give you some kind of hope in here. It says, scholars caution that accurate information on church closings is very hard to come by, and also that the number of closings are still relatively small. So it gives you, they're between 320,000 and 350,000 Protestant churches in the U.S., so a closure of 4,500 churches is still a loss of about 1.4%. So it tries to say, tries to give you some hope that it seems like really big numbers, which it is, but it's still representative of about 1.4%. However, the trend is still disturbing. I mean, frankly, you look at that, and again, it's not hard to see. I mean, anybody who, you don't even have to look at necessarily these statistics, look at our society, and you see what the church's role has been and should be is partly in society we're the salt of the earth. A salt changes something. It doesn't get changed by something. So the salt is the moral compass. The church is the moral compass of society, should function as that. And when it starts to lose its saltiness, to use the biblical language there, then what good is it? How effective is the church being? And I think that's a question that we have to ask ourselves as, well, Protestant and even Catholic churches. As Christians, we have to ask ourselves, how are we approaching evangelism? How are we approaching sharing the gospel? Because clearly we're seeing it is not as effective as it has been. And so we kind of have to re-envision that and rethink, especially now. And I think Pastor Jay made a good point in his message where he said, now we're officially, more people don't go to church than do. And so we can't keep thinking of the mission field as, far off countries. It's right in our backyards. Yeah. And so how are we going to approach that?
Yeah, and Tim Foster says here on YouTube, Pastor Jay is correct. We are in a post-Christian nation. That's something that I know Pastor Jay has hit on a number of times. When I see, there's another one? Okay, we're going to wait a second. It takes me a minute. Oh, there it is. Jesus says, throw it out if the salt loses its saltiness. Yep. Yeah. So when I see something like this, my initial reaction is, oh boy, a bunch of Christians are going to get really downtrodden by this kind of thing. And I look at it and say, except my hope isn't in numbers. My hope is in Jesus Christ.
Amen. Amen.
And God's still in control,
right?
No matter what we see here. Now, when I see things like this, one of the things I think is, well, this is why I'm not a postmillennialist. Those who don't know postmillennialism, I mean, not all necessarily branches, but one of the beliefs of many branches of postmillennialism is that we're going to see a worldwide evangelization where overwhelming number of percentages of people in the world are going to come to accept Christ prior to his second coming. There's biblical reasons I don't necessarily agree with that, but it's things like this, I just don't think that's what we've been seeing happening for the last 2,000 years. And it's certainly not what we're seeing now. And I do think that, a lot of it, is, I'm Lutheran, so I put a very high role in the Holy Spirit as far as the role in these conversions and people, accepting Christ and things like that. Right. So when I see numbers like this, to me, it doesn't hurt my hope at all. It's not something I want to see, obviously. Sure. And if anything, what I think this does is it should, to take a quote from C.S. Lewis completely out of context, it should be the megaphone to rouse a deaf world. It could be megaphone that's completely out of context. Okay? That was about pain and suffering and all that. But it's still a good reminder that when we see things like this, it's a Tim Foster, the 1,000-year reign is after Jesus comes. Tim, obviously, you are a premillennialist. That's not the topic I was going to go into here about premillennialism, postmillennium, amillennialism. Suffice it to say, that's kind of what we're going over in my current seminary class. That's why it's on my brain right now. If people think that Ken's just spouting off all the millennial theories off the top of his head. No, it's what I happen to be studying at this moment. So, that's kind of what we go through. Not that I haven't studied it before, but, obviously in depth. So anyway, I just think we need to, when we see things like this, rather than taking it as a discouraging note, especially like you're saying, it's not a huge percentage. The bigger thing that worries me is the statistic that Pastor Jay, worries me is a bad word, but the one that Pastor Jay talks about, concerning, about 47%
don't belong to
anything. Because that shows a cultural trend, and that's a little bit more concerning to me.
And that 47%, incidentally, isn't just Christian churches. They don't belong to a church, mosque, synagogue. That's inclusive of more than just Christianity.
Right.
So less than half of the country worships anywhere. God.
Right.
Yeah.
Worships, I think, worships any God is a good way of putting it, because I think there's an increasing, obviously we see there's an increasing number of nuns out there, Nones, not Nuns, but also there's an increasing number of people, that's very popular in our culture, to say, oh, I'm spiritual but not religious, or I just don't like organized religion, so I believe in God, but I don't want to go to church. Well, what happens when you have that kind of mentality permeating your culture? You've got a lot of, frankly, contradictory views about God that are out there. Quite often, people within their own worldview have a lot of contradictory views, but they just haven't, because they're not going to a church, a synagogue, a mosque, anything like that. They're never being taught anything. They're never having to really think through the consistency of their own worldviews. And Tim Foster says, Revelation 20 is after Revelation 19. Duh, right, with a smiley face. Yes. So that I agree, like I said, that I don't think this is, alarm bells. There should never be alarm bells for us. Our mission is to just do what the Great Commission says to do.
Yeah.
And I guess my attitude is, I kind of like, this is why I like Greg Kokel. I've talked about a number of times on this show, where he's an apologist that I've admit to being very, very heavily influenced by. And what he says, he sees his role when he's having apologetic conversations, evangelism conversations. He says he sets the goal of not necessarily converting everybody in that conversation, all right? Because there are reapers, there are sowers,
right?
And you don't know what role you're playing right then and there. If somebody comes to Christ because you talk to them, it's probably because 20 people before you had conversations with them, okay?
And it's definitely because the Holy Spirit was there.
Yeah, exactly.
So, yeah.
And the Holy Spirit's working the whole thing and how they work. But he says he sets his goal in a conversation is just to put a stone in someone's shoe. You ever have a little pebble in your shoe, and you might be trying to walk along, you might be trying to think about something else, but it's like, oh yeah, I need to get groceries, pebble. Oh, I need to do this. The pebble. Oh man, you can't stop thinking about the pebble in your shoe. Right? It's nagging at you. And that's what he sets his goal out to be in these conversations. And that's kind of been a philosophy I've tried to adopt. It's like, look, ultimately, who's determining whether someone's going to be open to the gospel or not ain't me. It's the Holy Spirit. And so my concern is to do what I'm called upon by God to do and, leave the results to the Holy Spirit. But I have to be open to the fact that the Holy Spirit's moving in me also. Yeah. And the Holy Spirit quite often might want to use me as the agent through which he acts to bring that person to an acceptance of Christ. So we have to be willing to do that. But when you have that kind of perspective, it's like, look, I'm an agent. I'm an ambassador of God. This is what I do. The results ain't ultimately up to me. I just have to be obedient and leave the results up to God. Then when you see things like this, it's not going to discourage you. It's like, it's what God wants to happen is what's going to happen. He's in control. I'm just going to do what I'm supposed to do.
Yeah, it's exactly like, Jesus says, the harvest is plentiful, workers are few. And so that is a charge, if anything, for those workers who remain to, the work is out there. So let's, be about our Father's business.
Yeah, I guess I'd say if you're going to take away anything from this story, if you're not sharing your faith, let's all do some real introspection here, and let's be honest with ourselves. If we're not sharing our faith, all right, if people don't know you're Christian, all right, then maybe let this be that megaphone to rouse you to fulfill the Great Commission, because, I don't think there's any doubt what Jesus was saying there at the end of Matthew.
It's not the Great Suggestion.
Yeah, exactly. It's not the Great Suggestion. It's the Great Commission. It is part of what it means to be a Christian. And that's kind of when you accepted Christ, Christ is not just your Savior. He's your Lord and Savior. You can't accept one without accepting the other. And I think all too often we love the Savior part.
Yeah.
Not always too keen about the Lord part. And if he's your Lord, guess what that means? You do what he says. Right. It's plain and simple.
Well put.
So anyway, great. good show.
Yeah, I think
like
so.
that.
Thank you, everybody, for joining in.
Yeah, if you disagree with us, hopefully, and there may have been some times tonight that we didn't exhibit as well as we were supposed to, and hopefully we did. I leave that up to God's judgment, obviously, but that's always our goal, to try to discuss things honestly, without compromising the truth, but with gentleness and respect. So hopefully we were able to model that for you all. Hey, we are back. We'll be back next week. We are here just about every Wednesday at 5:30. This was episode, what are we up to now? 158. Yeah, man. So that's a lot. We've been around for a long time. So I just love the fact that we still get to do this, and it's been a pleasure. Even before we did this whole format, or this new format, rather, about 50 episodes or so ago, you were still the most common guest host or whatever on Trinity Talk Live. So Ben and I have been at this for a very long time. As a matter of fact, I just got this past week, I got a Facebook notice, one of these memories, where I had advertised 4 years. In 4 years, I was saying, here's our premiere episode of Trinity Talk Live, which had me, had you, and had Ryan. We talked about that a while ago. So it's been 4 years we've been doing this. That's pretty amazing.
Crazy.
I know we've simplified a lot. It's a lot easier to do now than it was back then too. We got better equipment too.
Well, we didn't have. We have better equipment running around.
And the teardown.
Tear down some. Well, we can do it. We got an office where a lot of things stay here. It's easier set up. We got a nicer camera. We have nice lights. We had garage those garage lights. Workshop lights is what we had to work with originally, and we were doing it upstairs in Heritage Hall, which the lighting we had at the time up there in Heritage Hall, it was horrible, because you'd be watching the episode, and if you were to scroll through it quickly, you'd see it get dimmer and get brighter. It was impossible to light and put on camera because it kept going inconsistently over and over again. Jeanette Harrington says, good show. Amen. God is in control. Amen, Jeanette. Yes, he is. And I should yield to that control and see where he's going to lead people after the show by ending the show.
We've got another comment.
We got another comment on what? On
YouTube.
Facebook?
No, YouTube.
YouTube. We got to go back to YouTube.
I was just going to say that we now have a minion to help us set up.
We do have a minion to help us set up. I don't think he's watching this week. He was watching last week. Tim says, along with the Great Commission, we get to cast out demons and handle serpents. I have not heard about that part. There's some difference of theological opinions, which we're wrapping up the show, so we're not going to go into right now. But Ben will lead off with that next week.
Hey, sure.
It's called passing the buck. About
make a note of it, Ben.
What's that?
I said make a note of it, Ben.
We'll put a pin in that.
So, hey, thank you all very much. It's been a great conversation this evening. Make sure you join us again next Wednesday at 5:30, where we will have probably 4 more intellectually stimulating topics. And again, just a reminder, if you're watching this after the fact, go ahead and put your thoughts in the comment section of the YouTube video, and we will bring them up and talk about them at the start of next week's show, just like we did today. All right? Yeah. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you, Ken.
Thank you, Mary Kay.
Okay.
And thank you, everybody who's out there watching. See you next week. God bless.